Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Christopher C. Gorham, and ASL interpreter Judy. Christopher holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse University College of Law. He practiced law for over a decade and for the last several years has taught modern American history at Westford Academy in Westford, Massachusetts. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and online publications. The Confidante is his first book, which I have to say is fantastic. He and his wife Elizabeth live in Watertown and Chatham, Massachusetts. Chris, this is a wonderful book, and I love the stories about FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt in there. I'm assuming your teaching led you to this story?
Yes, it has, Diane, and I'm happy to be here. Someone's turned on the lawnmower. I'm going to shut my window here. It's not
Oh,
usually
yes, these chores that never stop, huh?
it's not usually this warm and beautiful in the Boston area, but as you mentioned, I teach high school history in the suburbs outside of Boston, and it was in connection with my teaching that I came across this story. It was about 6 years ago. I was with a group of students launching their research paper project. And one of my students wanted to write about the Forgotten War, the
Oh,
Korean
wow.
War. So I pulled off a book from the shelf and it opened up to a page where President Truman was standing there with a big smile on his face, and standing right next to him was a woman I'd never seen before, but she also had a big smile on her face, and she was clearly a civilian based on what she was wearing. And it looked like they were sharing a joke. And the caption said, "The Assistant Secretary of Defense, Anna Rosenberg," and the year was 1951. And I just thought to myself, wow, who's this woman? We've heard of Frances Perkins. We've obviously heard of Eleanor Roosevelt. But who is this woman who is a top official at the Pentagon as a civilian during the Korean War on good terms with the president, and with the last name of Rosenberg, which was an unfortunate coincidence at the time, of course, because the Rosenberg spy case, which was completely unrelated, but that name carried connotations at that time. And I thought, gee, students, we ought to put this person on our list of research topics. But there were no books to be had. My students said to me a few days later, "Mr. Gorham, we can't find any books on her." We found that her papers had been left at Harvard back in 1986 or 87. So a few weeks after that, my wife and I met some of these students down at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and we looked at the boxes of documents, and they gave us the gloves. And within about 30 seconds, one of my students said, "Gorham, you got to come look at this." And it was the citation making Anna Rosenberg the first American man or woman to be awarded the Medal of Freedom. So it was quite a day.
Huh. Wow.
Wow, that must have really excited your students as well. Did some of them get more turned on to history and research because of this?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and I maybe not with respect to this particular subject, but what the kids I think learned that day throughout the process of me writing and talking about it with them is that primary sources and archives, you're almost in the central nervous system of history. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
we always teach the high school age kids, the primary sources are your friend, they're the best source, but to see archives and to demystify the archives for them is an opportunity for them to really see how professional historians work. So I'm really gratified that some of the students really took that and ran with it.
Yeah. Because now a lot of people just Google and expect everything to be truthful and everything to be there. And it's neither one of those is correct.
You're exactly right, Diana. There's no feeling like opening a box of old dusty documents and finding something that just gives you goosebumps and makes you excited to learn more. So that's a tremendous feeling.
Have you done that a lot? Have you opened a lot of dusty old boxes?
I have, and one of going back to, I'm working on my second manuscript now, but going back to the Anna Rosenberg manuscript, it was it was a book that was actually quite dusty, the old book from the mid 1946 or 47. It was a Jewish women's organization in the Midwest, covered with dust. I don't even know how I found it, but I opened it up and blew the dust off, and that was the only account that I ever found where Anna Rosenberg talked about visiting the first concentration camp during World War II. Had I not opened that box and opened that book, it wouldn't have been in my book, and it just would have been lost to history. So kind of an accident, but a happy accident.
Wow.
When you're allowed to study archival documents, are you typically allowed to copy them or typically not allowed, or how does that work?
Tom, they have a lot more rules, and I learned, most
Uh-oh.
the hard way from the librarians. But um, they want you to pull one file at a time out.
Hmm.
They want you to try and keep that file in order, the contents of that file in order. You can scan, at least at Harvard and some of the other venues at institutions where I did research. Scanning was allowed. And by and large, it was a wonderful way to spend a couple of days, whether it was the FDR Museum, whether it was Harvard, whether it was Syracuse or the like. So, but yeah, they love that. They have to take care of that stuff. So they want you to treat it with respect.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's why the gloves, right? Those white gloves.
That's right.
Hmm. Hmm.
We usually only think of those with detective stories, but in a way, you are a detective when you're researching these books.
Hmm.
That's the vibe. I mean, that's the feeling. And I think that's also a fun thing to kind of sell kids on the idea. You're out there, you're a history detective. You're out there trying to add your voice to a discussion rather than looking at the books on the shelf and just thinking they're like tablets from on high where you don't really have an opportunity to have a dialogue. But that's not the truth. The truth is that if you bring the receipts and if you have the primary sources, and if you've looked in the boxes of archival documents and made your argument, you can add your voice to that conversation. And what a great lesson for young people.
How did you get into history? What turned you on about history from being a lawyer?
Wow, Diane, I was a boy growing up in Michigan, and my grandfather would take out his cigar box of mementos from his time in World War II, and patches and photographs and newspaper clippings and medals. And I was, completely won over and just mesmerized. And in addition to those mementos that he had a wonderful library of history books. And I was just, when I could spend time in his library and read about Napoleonic Wars, read about, the explorers, it was just a lifelong love affair for me and something that has been a big part of my identity.
Hmm. That's interesting because I used a lot of earlier history books for my children when I was homeschooling them. And there were certain books that I read. I said, you have to realize that this writer is a product of his time, right? And there was a British man, I can't remember his name right now, who wrote a lot of history books from the British Empire
Yeah,
point of
yeah,
view. And the way he referred to anybody who wasn't British, we would never put up with that today,
that's right.
right?
That's right.
But it's a really important perspective to have because there were other insights he gave that were really interesting. And also, when you look at that perspective, you can understand where the treatment came, right? Where the prejudices started over 200 years ago, really.
That's such a great point because you can see, sometimes you ask yourself, or I will ask my students, ought we to grade this writer on a curve from the context where they were from? And it also shows that, historical figures, their stock can rise and fall, over time. Take Woodrow Wilson, mostly considered a top quartile president, but, virulent racist, and his stock has fallen in some quarters. And you take someone like Anna Rosenberg, the subject of my book, she was a famous woman in the 1940s and 50s and just went poof,
Right.
lost the history completely, not because of something that she did or an idea belief that she held, but for other reasons that I discussed in the book. But a famous person who is largely forgotten today, although I hope that's changing with
Well,
this.
you're helping to change it.
Thank you for saying so.
Who are you off discovering now?
Well, my publisher it's very gratifying that they would like me to write another book for them. So I've suggested a story of the artists who were making very, very hard decisions in occupied France and in Nazi occupied France, the French artists who had writers and painters who had, I guess, in some ways, easy decisions to make, but in other ways, not so easy.
Yeah.
And with the authoritarians coming into power and the Vichy regime and so forth, carving up that country. So it's quite a story. I'm very excited about it, and it's led me on to some new boxes of dusty documents.
So do you like artwork?
I do. I do. My father's an artist, lifelong artist, and very hardworking and work ethic I've seen throughout my life. He loves to do what he loves to do, and I think I feel that way about writing history. I love it. I try and do it every single day, and I always try to get better at my craft. And in terms of, I've always sort of been fascinated too by uh, artists during times of war, like poets of World War I who were in the trenches, the soldiers who took to poetry, or the writers who found themselves, in occupied territory and had to, deal with censorship and deal with the authorities. And I find that just kind of a fascinating wrinkle of military or of war narratives. How did the artist deal with the trauma of warfare?
And how do they still get their stories out and the truth?
Sure, right. And how did they reflect? Because, obviously painters, they don't all paint the charge of the Light Brigade. They take those emotions and those anxieties and that despair, and they put it into art. And sometimes it's easier to see than other times.
So what is your writing process?
Well, I try to write every day. I try to, it's obviously easier in the summertime, but I try to write every morning, get an hour or two in, and I research and write sort of at the same time. So I have my pile of research and my computer open at the same time. So I'm not one of those people that does all the research and takes notes and then goes back and types it. I do the reading and the researching sort of at the same time as I write. And I find it helpful to also read some fiction from the time that I'm writing about, and even maybe some poetry from the time that I'm writing about, because I love to put those little bits of poetry at the top of the chapter to give the reader an idea of what the vibe might be in the coming chapter.
Right. And what the society is like.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of your the point you made about old British Empire histories and sort of shock of reading them today. And, I think of Rudyard Kipling, just a, pro-imperialist. Some of his stuff obviously still taught today, but yeah, it's certainly a added complication when you start to unravel how those views, once so widely held in the British Empire, just they aren't held today like they were then, for sure.
Yeah. And how we moved as a people, how we moved from there to where we are now. And it's always swinging back and forth, isn't it? We never quite get clear of our prejudices.
That's such a great point. And in my book, The Confidante, about the person Anna Rosenberg, I was doing the research and writing at a very difficult time in U.S. history, where there was a lot of prejudice and hatred floating around, it seemed. And a lot of people around me thought, well, I don't, this is not who we are, the United States. How can misinformation and anti-Semitism and racial hatred? And I just said, hey, look, we go back to the 1950s during the era of Joe McCarthy. And, it's some terrible things, anti-Semitic comments on the floor of the House, senators holding those abhorrent views, hate sheets printed in garages and disseminated. So we've been through this probably a couple of times, this fever sometimes that we seem to get into, and hopefully the fever will break.
Amen to that. That might be an interesting thing to put forward too, how the cycles of hate go through this country.
Yeah, you see it. I'm teaching my juniors right now. We're getting into the late New Deal and the 1930s foreign policy and the road to the Second World War, and you can see, this very intelligent, one of the most intelligent peoples on earth, the Germans. That you can see them, walking straight into barbarism and and bringing the world with them. and it's painful to see and painful to think that those what fuels that is still fuel out there in the world today. Like you said, we haven't quite outrun the history yet,
No,
prejudices yet.
no.
Do you find you have to, I don't know, force yourself to sit down and write every morning, or is it such a habit that you just do it, or is it easy? I don't know if you can say anything about that.
It's not easy, but it's not a chore. I don't see it as a chore, Tom. I enjoy when you've finished that paragraph and you've got your source kind of embedded in it, and you've sort of made your point, and you've done so in a efficient yet dramatic way. It's kind of like putting a little puzzle together, and then you move on to the next little puzzle. And I find it fun isn't the word, but rewarding,
Ah,
rewarding, and that the idea that like a NASCAR race car, if you get a little tiny bit faster every day, if you get a little bit faster every day, even if it's 1/100th of a mile per hour faster, I try to be that person as I write. I try to learn from other writers that I admire and build in some of the things that they do really well, and while still making it my own voice.
cool. Thank you.
Who are some of the people that you admire as writers?
Well, I've been reading a lot of Candace Millard, who's written a wonderful book, very dramatic, about James Garfield, if you can believe it, which is wonderful. There was an older French American historian named Ted Morgan that I've rediscovered, and he was pretty popular in the 80s and 90s, but I rediscovered his works, and just an elegant writer, prize-winning writer. So is Candace Millard. A little Eric Larson from time to time, with that pacing that is just so breathless. And, there's probably about like I said, some fiction as well. Some I read for my research on the artist in France during occupied France. I read a lot of poetry, French poetry, and had to have my wife translate for me.
Oh,
I was
So
going to ask if you were bilingual.
I can manage to take the autobus in France and to order a meal, but not much beyond that.
Oh gosh. I'm embarrassingly monolingual, which is what happens to most Americans, right? Because of how we live in this
Yeah,
country.
yeah.
But
And I think not to always go back to Anna Rosenberg, subject of my book, but she spoke Hungarian because she was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's where she was born, in Budapest. She spoke German because that was also the language that you had to kind of speak to get around in that empire. And then as a 10-year-old, she comes to the United States and doesn't really know a lick of English, and goes to the public schools of New York City. And she comes out speaking English with a Bronx and Hungarian accent.
wow.
It's great. It's great to listen to. But then, she was also very self-conscious because she was in the halls of power with people that had that transatlantic accent, the
right.
motto and the theater, and
Yeah.
people that had gone through the private schools and then the Ivy League. So she was self-conscious about that, but also I find it very charming to hear her on radio, or to see her on television in the early 1950s, and with that marvelous voice of hers.
My grandfather, who was immigrated from Italy, went back to Europe with my father before I was born, and they were in London, and they asked Bobby for directions, and my grandfather turned to my father and said, "Why you no speak of the English?" He couldn't understand him.
Oh, right.
Accents are so incredibly difficult sometimes.
What is it? Two peoples separated by a common language.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Some of those, right? Some of those, Scottish actors in particular, or Welsh actors, boy, very difficult.
Yeah, the thickness of their consonants is
That's right.
amazing. So how did you go from being a lawyer to teaching history and writing?
Well, like I said, Diane, I had been bit by the bug early on, and I love maybe a strong word. I found being a lawyer very rewarding. It's a noble profession, or it can be, but I never really could shake that that real desire to do something history related. And so when I was just before I turned 40 years old, my wife was indulgent enough to let me go back and get my master's so I could teach history here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So
Thank you, wife.
she said I've been a lot nicer, a lot better husband since, being a history teacher than I was a lawyer. And those kids every day, they keep you young, and they're just a joy to be around. It's Spirit Week at our high school this week. So,
Wow.
pajamas yesterday, and today they were dressed up as if they were going to the beach. So it does keep you young.
Yeah, and they keep you on your toes too, right? They
That too.
challenge you to think about different things and in different ways.
Sure. And I think, my storytelling in large part really comes from them, to keep 17-year-olds engaged at 7:35 in the morning. You have to have your chops. So it's really made me a more efficient and a more dramatic and a better storyteller.
Huh. I'm remembering my kids when they were high schoolers trying to get up. Oh my gosh. It's just not in their biorhythm yet.
Oh, I know. Studies have shown, but yeah, it's they come in. I'm sure your kids did not do this, but my kids come in with the iced Dunkin' coffees, all of them marching in. So they have a little caffeine to get them jump started in the morning.
Yeah. If that works. It doesn't work for everybody.
You're right about that. Yes.
So
if you ever copied stuff from an archive, did you ever have the experience that later you were looking at the copy and finally something registered, or you saw a connection, or maybe you saw pieces from two different places, and then you made a connection? So after the initial study of the archive, did you ever have the experience of making connections later?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I learned is when you find a good piece of research, you almost have to look at it. You wind up looking at it like 10 times. Like the initial, there's the initial excitement where you take the obvious pull, the pull quotes out of that really, really help you make your point. But you keep when these key documents, I call them, which is dumb, but just these key documents, you keep going back to them and finding different layers and in doing the research for the Anna Rosenberg book, The Confidante. What amazed me about the research in that book is to keep finding box after box, this woman not only at the periphery of all of these events, from women's suffrage to the New Deal to the Second World War to integration to the Cold War, but she was at the heart of these events. And that was then you go back to the boxes you previously gone through and say, wow, she was, I still marvel that here's this civilian woman from New York, a former New Dealer, is this Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, and sort of handpicked, to take on that role for President Truman and for Secretary of Defense George Marshall. So I still kind of marvel at that fact even now, 18 months after the book's been published.
Okay.
It's inspiring then.
I've gotten a lot of feedback along those lines. People, not just women but Americans. This is, I think, my 94th event or 95th event since the publication date, and in many, many states across the union, I've talked to audiences, and I get, I find that many of them see her as an inspiring American citizen, an exemplary citizen, the kind of citizen with the kind of beliefs that we could use today, or that we could be ourselves today.
Sure.
She had consistent beliefs that, her consistent belief was that our democracy was always stronger the more social equality that the different groups had. If women would take those jobs in World War II, Anna said, they would get on the other side greater social equality. If true of Black Americans too. And to a certain extent, she was right, and to an extent, it took longer than she would have wanted it to. And we're still working on our equality issues and issues of fairness and fundamental fairness. that would make us an even stronger democracy than we are.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. If you
Diana, Tom, and Judy, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Sure. This has been incredible, Chris. And for all of those who'd like to join us for his reading and Q&A, it's during our January Arts Saturday. Please register through Eventbrite. You can also purchase his books on our online bookstore. That's bookshop.org/shop. Bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. We'd also like to thank our many sponsors for making this program possible. If you'd like to become a sponsor, well, my goodness, I just lost that page. Here we go. We're coming up. Please go to our website as well. That's drakearts/donate and join these wonderful people who make these programs possible. We'd like to especially thank the towns of Drake and Wilmington and Westford that make these programs possible through the Massachusetts Cultural Council grants. For more information about our Arts Saturdays and other programs, visit our website, drakeatarts.com, or email us at drakeatarts@gmail.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake at Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@drakeatarts.